First up today we have special guest, Whitney Webb. She is a writer, researcher, investigative journalist, and an expert on the Jeffrey Epstein case. Her new book about Epstein case is called One Nation Under Blackmail. There's the first one. There's volume 2, One Nation Under Blackmail. That's where she focuses on Jeffrey Epstein. She also writes for a number of different publications, but you can catch her at her own site, unlimitedhangout.com. Please welcome Whitney Webb. Hi, Whitney.
Hey, great to be here. Thanks for having me back on.
So I'm reading unfortunately, I didn't get an advance copy of the book, so I'm going to be just like anybody else in the audience tonight. Like, hey, I'm going to ask questions. And, the description of the book is something I want to read it for people. It says, One Nation Under Blackmail is a damning indictment of the consequences resulting from the nearly century-old relationship between both U.S. and Israeli intelligence and the organized crime network known as the National Crime Syndicate. Can you is that real? There's a thing called the National Crime Syndicate? This seems like a cartoon.
Yeah, well, no, it is real. So it was a decentralized network of different organized crime groups operating in the United States in the early 20th century. So historically, organized crime in the U.S., most people are probably familiar with it because of Hollywood and whatnot, tend to sort of be an ethnic enclave. So you'd have Irish organized crime, the Jewish mob, the Italian Mafia, and so on. So the National Crime Syndicate sort of broke down those silos and brought these different groups together, and that made them a lot more successful.
But that was their name, the National Crime Syndicate?
Yes, yes.
And they didn't have any qualms about. So this is in documents that they were referred to as this?
Yeah. It's definitely not something I made up. That's for sure. So this was basically an outgrowth of something called Murder Inc. and some other things. The main people behind it were Mayor Lansky, I guess representing the Jewish mob there, and then Lucky Luciano of the Italian Mafia. And so they basically came together, and in World War II, they formally teamed up with the Office of Naval Intelligence and the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, which is the precursor to the CIA. And this was justified as necessary because it was the war, right? So a wartime necessity justification. But then the war ends, and then, the intelligence apparatus of the U.S. and these mob guys realize they have a lot in common and they work really well together. And so that's why in the 60s, in the 50s, you see a lot of the people involved in assassination stuff for the CIA after it was made. You see a lot of mob guys around, for example. And there's a lot of other examples of them, interacting on and off, over the years that maybe more people are familiar with. But, a lot of this involved like the realm of shadow banking finance. It expanded into the world of corporate power as well, and ended up just really becoming out of control. And also, you have, like you mentioned earlier, Israeli intelligence sort of get involved in this developing power nexus as well, because the Jewish mob side of the National Crime Syndicate was heavily involved in the arming of the Haganah, and the precursor to the IDF and all of this. So basically, by the time the State of Israel is created, these alliances are, part of its national security state from the off.
So you've documented literally the organized crime from World War II era coming together with our government.
Yeah.
And working together now, and to coordinate all them together, all the different crime families. There was a thing called the National Crime Syndicate that
but they fought with each other. Like there was factionalism, and so like some of these guys teamed up to take out their competition, consolidate power. So I wouldn't say that this group, right, is the same they were back in the 30s and 20s. I mean, a lot has happened over time, but I think I make a really good case in the book that this is where a lot of it started, or you could maybe argue it happened before, specifically in New York City, because you had the Democratic Party, specifically in New York City, become very much entwined with organized crime. This happened in the early 20th century as well with Tammany Hall, which was very much involved with the power apparatus of New York, but they ended up taking over, organized crime ended up taking over the leadership of a lot of unions and later voting precincts, among other things, which allowed them to consolidate a lot of power in New York, specifically in the Democratic Party at first. And of course, later the Republicans as well. But that's part of what what led to Operation Underworld, as it's called, the formal team up between the mob and the Navy, naval intelligence,
What?
and the CIA precursor.
There's a name for it? It's called,
it's called Operation Underworld. It's a real thing. You can look it up. The U.S. government waited 60 years to admit it was real, but they had to eventually.
And what did they do? And what was Operation Underworld?
That's where the Office of Naval Intelligence and the precursor to the CIA, the Office of Strategic Services, teamed up with organized crime.
And what specifically what was the service that organized crime could provide that the government couldn't do for themselves?
Yeah, so what I mentioned earlier about the mob and the unions, what they wanted was intelligence from the dock workers, and the dock workers union was controlled by the mob.
Oh.
So that's sort of how it started, but it advanced
that was like
a lot.
So getting info on the unions is kind of their way to push back against the commies, right?
Well, this is back in World War II, right? So it was about German saboteurs. It was about the Nazis. But then you see over time that a lot of the same type of behavior is, all sorts of things, including working with organized crime or drug cartels or what have you. In the decades later, like in the 80s, for example, it's all justified by quote unquote anti-communism and stuff like that.
And so why? So I really appreciate you reporting on this. Why is no one else seemingly? I haven't heard anything about this until people told me about your book. So why is no one else or are other people reporting this?
Well, I think it's been written on before, but I don't think it's been the story's been told the same way. I guess I sort of strung it together. I'm sort of giving you 100-year history. I think there are people that have written about Operation Underworld specifically, but not necessarily like recently, because it was something that was they let be known maybe like 20 years ago or something.
And so they're still not letting us know about the Kennedy assassination. So you can't actually, But what did you uncover anything that would lead to any knowledge about that and the CIA's involvement? Because I had Ray McGovern on Wednesday, and he said that there definitely was.
So from what I understand, there have been some successful efforts to get new information out from the documents they've been trying not to release that more or less are being described as smoking gun evidence that Lee Harvey Oswald had established relationship with the CIA. So I didn't really deal with the Kennedy assassination directly in the book, because then it would have been like 3 books. Because there's people that have written entire books, right, about the Kennedy assassination. So I talked about some things. I talked about Perm Index, for example, which is a sort of a suspect company that a lot of people that have investigated the Kennedy assassination over the years have pointed to in their connections to this particular network that I'm writing about in the book. And I also write about an effort to sexually blackmail John F. Kennedy after he was elected and the time he was president-elect and before inauguration. And that same sexual blackmail network, it was British intelligence, British intelligence and British organized crime. They had previously taken down the government in the UK in what is known as the Profumo affair. And one of the same women that was used in that network was taken overseas to New York, allegedly slept with Kennedy. And then somehow the CIA allegedly helped her escape back to the UK. The FBI arrested her and her apparent handler, had her client list. Sound familiar? But instead of releasing the client list, they destroyed it.
It does sound familiar. Yeah. I didn't know about this. I've never heard about that. So the intelligence tried to set a trap. So it sounds like, so we're going to connect this together because the second part of your book is about Jeffrey Epstein, and Jeffrey Epstein obviously had connections to the CIA and the intelligence community. So it seems like they would try to get this blackmail stuff on powerful people, and then they could get them to do their biddings. But did it work with Kennedy? It seems like it didn't work.
No, it didn't really work there because it was exposed to an
Okay.
extent, the operation, and traced back to British intelligence. So there was a very sloppy cover up where Mariella Novotny, who was the name of the girl, was how she was allowed to flee the country with the apparent help of U.S. intelligence, because at that time there was a very cozy relationship, I guess you could say, and there arguably still is, between U.S. and British intelligence, right?
Yeah.
And so she was allowed sort of to get out unscathed. But yeah, one of the things that really surprised me when writing this book is how sexual blackmail pops up over and over again in various big events and scandals in U.S. history. And so part of what I'm trying to show, and a big reason why I wrote Volume 1, is to really break apart the mainstream media narrative that Jeffrey Epstein was an anomaly, that his behavior was exclusive to him, and now he's dead, so none of this stuff it doesn't matter anymore. This is a type of activity that has been done over and over and over again in our political system, and it was it was a move, and it's a type of operation really that was perfected first by the mob. So, this is something that's really born out of, in my opinion, this organized crime intelligence team up. And now, it's just been going on for an excessive amount of time at this point.
So here, well, let me give this to you as a jumping off point. This is more from the description of the book. It says this book specifically explores how the nexus between intelligence and organized crime directly developed the sexual blackmail tactics and networks that would later enable the sexual blackmail operation and other crimes of deceased pedophile and sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. Other books on Jeffrey Epstein focus on the depraved nature of his crimes or his wealth and his most famous politically connected friends and acquaintances, but this book, in contrast, reveals the extent to which Epstein's activities were state-sponsored through an exploration of his intelligence connection. So tell me about, so when the Pizzagate thing happened, right, when Pizzagate broke, that story, I didn't pay much attention to it, but what did catch my eye was what I thought was an overreaction to a bunch of people online saying that there was a sexual pedophile ring in Washington, D.C. And I'm like, well, first of all, that sounds completely reasonable. To assume that there's a sex pedophile ring servicing powerful people in Washington, D.C. That's not crazy to think that could happen. And then no, I just lost my chain of thought. So they overreacted to that. Just like Seth Rich, if you even mentioned it, you were banished from society. You couldn't ask questions about it. You couldn't cover it. You couldn't do anything. And I was just like, what is going on? Why are they overreacting to this Pizzagate thing so much? Why do they have to? Why is that? And then you find out it's because there actually is a pedophile ring happening, and it's sponsored by the intelligence community, and it involves a bunch of really powerful people, like part of the royal family and Bill Clinton, and people and Hollywood stars and people like that go to Jeffrey Epstein's island and have sex with kids. And we know this for a fact, and there's a flight log. And so I guess that was, just like when the Wuhan virus, people were speculating that COVID started from a virus that was engineered in a lab in Wuhan, China, and they immediately have to overreact to that and say you're a racist if you think that, right? So that was, that's again, your flag, my bullshit detector went off. You guys are overreacting too hard to that. And so what you are saying is that Jeffrey Epstein isn't a one-off. This isn't some anomaly inside of our culture. No. This is a regular classic CIA psyop, or classic CIA program to do this. This is how they get powerful people under the CIA's control to do their bidding. This is probably why Donald Trump didn't release those JFK files on his way out the door, because the CIA didn't want him to do it, and they probably have blackmail material on him. And they tried to blackmail him a million different ways. One way was Russiagate. Another way was the P tape. Another way was with his impeachment. They blackmailed him, saying we're gonna have the Senate go along with the impeachment if you do that. So anyway, this is a very long question, so take it wherever you want.
Okay, so there's a lot of different places to go. So I guess first off, yes, this is something that's been going on a very long time. In fact, the longtime director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, who was in charge of that agency for decades and decades and decades, the top law enforcement official in the U.S., he was sexually blackmailed by the mob in the 30s. And he didn't even go after organized crime at all because of that. And that's a matter of record.
Really?
He denied it ever happened. And the sexual blackmail operation that entrapped him also intimately involved a man named Roy Cohn, who was best known as Donald Trump's mentor. And the two of them, along with a mob-linked businessman named Louis Rosenstein, were seen engaging in sexual blackmail operations themselves. But again, Hoover and Cohn only joined that after they themselves had been entrapped. Yeah. And this involved minors.
Oh,
so this
no
is something
kidding.
that's been going. Yeah, this is something that's been going on a really long time.
So you're saying,
and even in addition to that,
you're saying J. Edgar Hoover was entrapped sexually with a minor by the mob, by the mafia.
Well, so at first he was involved in this sexual blackmail operation after he was blackmailed by the mob. That involved children, but he was initially blackmailed because he was a photo of him was taken giving oral sex to his longtime deputy Clyde Tolson, and that was taken by affiliates of Mayor Lansky of the Jewish mob. And later, those fell into the hands of James Jesus Angleton, the first counterintelligence chief of the CIA. So that's another example of how the mob and the CIA like to share intelligence, right? And how the CIA can justify almost anything, right, in the name of gathering intelligence. I think actually in the UK they passed a law recently where intelligence agents or assets can even commit murder or any sort of crime as long as they justify it as intelligence gathering activity. So, this is something that gets brushed under the rug because there's no accountability for U.S. intelligence services at all. And in addition to that, I mean, you have things like the Page Boy scandal in 1982 that was brushed under the rug, where congressmen were caught basically engaging in sex with congressional pages who were underage.
Really? I forgot. I had this. It was in 1982.
Yep. And then you have the Franklin scandal. The expert on that is Nick Bryant, who, if you want to learn more about that, I would encourage you to have him on your show.
What is it?
But that was basically about Republican. It was a lobbyist that was running it. In Washington, named Craig Spence, nominally a lobbyist who claimed to have CIA connections. His partner was a guy named Larry King, based in Nebraska. Larry King would get kids from Nebraska, fly them out to D.C., and they would basically be raped and assaulted by powerful people. And it's a very crazy story. And again, I'm not the expert in that. I do include it in the book, of course, because it's very relevant. But of course, I'm drawing a lot from Bryant's work on that.
We covered the Jerry Sandusky situation. Now, he was the guy from Penn State who was sexually abusing the students constantly, and that through that story, I learned that there are networks of these pedophiles, and they have conventions almost, right? And that Jerry Sandusky would take their boys to be trafficked there to trade them and stuff like that. And
yeah, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't Louis Freeh, the former FBI director, involved in some aspect of covering up Sandusky's activities? Because he was also later hired by associates of Jeffrey Epstein to intimidate his victims from speaking out.
Really? No kidding. So let's move on.
He was Clinton's FBI director.
And then of course Bill Clinton's on the Jeffrey Epstein flight logs 27 times, even though he said it was only 4. Right? Wasn't it 27 he showed up, or 32?
It's something like that. Well, some of them are multiple trips. So they show up on the flight logs multiple times because he was, for example, going on this big trip around Africa. And so there were multiple flights within that one broader trip, right? So sometimes it sounds kind of misleading, to say 27 because they were, part of the same long journey around different countries in Africa, but it was a significant amount of times. And I don't think Bill Clinton was telling the truth about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein at all. Actually, at that point in time, Jeffrey Epstein and Bill Clinton had known each other for about a decade or so, which mainstream media seems uninclined and not interested in talking about at all. And Epstein was actually helping him set up the Clinton Foundation and the Clinton Health Access Initiative. And this is after more than a decade of Jeffrey Epstein being involved in the most controversial fundraisers in Clinton presidential history. Right after, and he began his involvement with Clinton fundraising right after his name was dropped from the case where he was named the mastermind of one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in U.S. history. So he basically goes from being one of the a notorious financial criminal to becoming, a financial wizard for the Clinton family. And so that's why he was probably picked to set up what a lot of people refer to as the family's political slush fund, the Clinton Foundation.
So that's what that was. The Clinton Foundation was a way to keep, while they weren't in elected office.
It's pay to play politics with the Clintons.
Yes, exactly.
That's how they do it.
Yeah,
they turn cronyism into an art form and pay to play politics.
Yeah, and but Sam Harris will tell you nothing they've done compares to Trump University. Trump University is almost like a cartoon of a scandal compared to this shit. Right? Am I right?
Well, when you're looking at Epstein, to me, the relationship with the Clinton White House that Epstein had is much more damning than the Trump relationship in the 90s. So apparently the Epstein, depending on who you believe, right, the Epstein-Trump relationship fizzled out in the early 2000s over a botched real estate deal where they were both competing over a Palm Beach mansion they wanted to buy. But in the 90s, it seems like, in the late 80s, Epstein and Trump were partying together and were very much part of the same social milieu. And then it seems like he helped arrange for Trump's two girlfriends in the 90s, one of whom he ended up marrying, Melania Trump. The first one was a woman named Selena Middelfart, who's a Norwegian heiress who actually accompanied Epstein on one of his 17 White House visits to the Clinton White House. And that was Trump's girlfriend before Melania. In my book, I talk about how, in my opinion, Jeffrey Epstein was involved in two parallel operations of sex trafficking. So there's the one that everyone knows about the underage exploited girls. But then there's these women that he invests in a lot of times when they're minors, but then funds their education and what have you over time and really develops them as assets. And then he marries them off to his powerful friends. And so it seems like those two women, Selena Middelfart and depending on, again, who you believe, he's alleged to have introduced Trump to Melania Trump, that both of those were sort of arranged by him. So tell me more about Jeffrey Epstein and his work with the government, like his ties with the CIA and stuff. Can you talk more about that? Okay, so it's not just the CIA. Israeli intelligence plays a major role here, and I would argue in terms of the sexual blackmail activities, that's going to be Israeli intelligence above the CIA, but most likely sharing intelligence with the CIA. Yeah, but earlier on in the 1980s, in the early 80s, which is when it seems like he gets directly involved with intelligence, it appears to have been the CIA, and then he gets tied up with the Maxwells sometime in the late 80s or early 90s, and at that point, it seems to shift again.
Isn't Ghislaine Maxwell's father? Wasn't she in the Mossad?
Yeah, so Robert Maxwell was very much involved with Israeli intelligence, several scandals actually that are poorly explored but really should be. So, for example, he sold software that had a backdoor for Israeli intelligence to two highly classified nuclear labs in the United States, Sandia and Los Alamos. And so all our nuclear secrets were stolen via espionage by the same the same guy who was handling Robert Maxwell in this case, Rafi Eitan. Rafi Eitan was also the handler of Jonathan Pollard, who was a big Israeli espionage scandal of the 1980s, because he was stealing a bunch of military secrets and giving it to Israel. Mm-hmm.
So that's a situation where Israel was spying on us, the United States.
Yes, and it actually has happened a lot, but. We can either talk about that or return to Epstein. I'm not sure what you're...
Let's return to Epstein.
Okay. So Epstein in the early 1980s, from the late 70s to the early 1980s, he's working at Bear Stearns. He has to leave Bear Stearns under, basically, it seems like a cloud of scandal. He was being investigated by the SEC over allegations that he was involved in insider trading that involved the Bronfman family company, Seagram's. And he appears to have been advised to leave his post at Bear Stearns. So at that point, he sort of enters this murky world where he claims he's either hiding or finding money for powerful people, looted money, so stolen money. So either he's helping financial criminals hide their loot, or he's helping the victims of financial criminals find what was stolen from them. So that should tell you right away that Jeffrey Epstein was an expert in shadow banking and illicit finance. His main clients, allegedly during this time, was Adnan Khashoggi. That's coming from a former business partner of his, Steve Hoffenberg, who's dead now, and Vicky Ward as well. And Adnan Khashoggi at this particular period of time was on the payroll of Israeli intelligence, involved with U.S. intelligence, Saudi intelligence, many intelligence agencies. But most importantly, he's one of the guys that in this exact period of time is setting into motion what later becomes known as Iran-Contra. So one of his main banks was called BCCI, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, which was really much more than a bank. It was really a private intelligence apparatus that was set up by Pakistani intelligence with the involvement of the CIA. And that particular bank was actually involved itself in sex trafficking minors to the elites of the United Arab Emirates, including prepubescent kids. So it's very possible that Jeffrey Epstein learned that art from them. Or he learned it from Adnan Khashoggi, who used his yacht to sexually blackmail businessmen and politicians so they would buy weapons from him. So straight from the off, you have something not right here.
So let me ask you a quick question. How do powerful people not see this kind of stuff coming? Like, how do they allow themselves to get entrapped by someone in a sex thing like this?
Well, I think after writing these books that depending on the circle of powerful people you're talking about, this is kind of normal. This kind of depravity is kind of normal in some of these circles. In the other cases, it might be naivety. They don't expect to be entrapped at this party or have this filmed when they go somewhere and everyone else is doing it. So why don't I partake as well? I mean, there's a lot of different reasons. Okay. And another possible reason, too, is that I think that, intelligence agencies don't just blackmail people once they're in power. I think there are cases where they blackmail people who are unknown and then elevate them into positions of power. And that way they're controlled right from the very beginning. Yeah. So then they can just partake as much as they want. Right.
Okay. So I'm sorry, I interrupted. Go back to your Jeffrey Epstein timeline.
Yeah. So at the same time, Adnan Khashoggi hires Jeffrey Epstein as a client to do finance stuff for him. He hires Roy Cohn as a lawyer, and he hires Robert Keith Gray as his PR guy. Robert Keith Gray is the guy behind the Pageboy scandal we talked about earlier. And I just mentioned how Roy Cohn also had a longstanding involvement of sexual blackmail. And at this time, Roy Cohn is also best known as a mob lawyer. So it's very interesting. You have these people all swimming around Adnan Khashoggi. And the other interesting thing is that just before this, Roy Cohn and Robert Keith Gray had worked very closely with Bill Casey at the Reagan campaign. They worked directly under him. Bill Casey is CIA director at this point. But that was only about 2 months before Jeffrey Epstein left Bear Stearns. And before he was CIA director, Bill Casey was the lawyer for Bear Stearns. So that's kind of an interesting connection because you have, legal trouble for Epstein at Bear Stearns. So it wouldn't necessarily have been Casey saying that he should go. It would have been whoever Casey put in charge of his legal portfolio while he's CIA director that would have told him that. And then he starts hanging around with all these, Casey associates involved in sexual blackmail. And then Adnan Khashoggi, who's the guy that is being used by Casey and others to set into motion Iran-Contra. And Iran-Contra a lot of times is misunderstood as just the arms for hostage crisis. But really what it was, in a broader sense, was Bill Casey was denied by Congress funding for sending weapons to the Contras. So he wanted to find a way to avoid ever having to ask Congress for money again, right? He wanted to find a way to make the black budget self-sustaining so he didn't have to have congressional oversight of anything the CIA did ever again. So it wasn't just about the Contras. It was about finding rackets that would, feed money into the CIA so they could do whatever covert operation they wanted anywhere in the world. And so in Iran-Contra, that's why you've drug trafficking and arms trafficking being major revenues of income for that particular operation and the Contra support apparatus. And of course, there's a lot more going on there, but that's essentially the world that Jeffrey Epstein's stepping into in the 1980s to a significant degree. And then in the later 80s, he gets involved with Leslie Wexner, who's also tied to organized crime and a lot of other crazy stuff. And then Stephen Hoffenberg, with whom he plans this giant Ponzi scheme. And then, as I mentioned earlier, his name gets dropped from the case and he's going and hanging around the Clinton White House.
Wow. So then he just, that's amazing. So he comes from Bears and Stearns. I didn't know Casey came from so the former.
Well, he was the lawyer.
Yeah.
So he was, yeah.
Yeah. But it's amazing. I mean, it's really fascinating to me. It is fascinating, all these. And so, so he gets in. So then he's just pals with the president of the United States. He becomes pals with Bill Clinton. And now, and we all know the story from there, right? So that, and then he just
it's even weirder than that. So the first guy that invites Jeffrey Epstein to the White House is Robert Rubin. And Robert Rubin later becomes Treasury Secretary under Clinton. But at this point, he's director of the National Economic Council. But right before that, and this is in the beginning of 93, so Rubin had only been in that position for a couple months. Before that, he's the head of Goldman Sachs, which is the bank that was the biggest accessory, arguably, to Robert Maxwell's financial crimes, including the stealing of the pension money from the people that work at the Mirror Group and some of the media organizations that he ran.
And
right? So that's an interesting connection.
You're talking about Ghislaine Maxwell's father.
Yeah, Robert Maxwell.
Robert Maxwell. Okay. So
who died in 1991 under odd circumstances.
Yes.
Again.
Yeah, it seems like seems like the Mossad killed him, right?
That's that seems to be the case. Yes. Yeah. Well, even Ghislaine Maxwell thinks that. She says it was rogue Mossad agents and Sicilian contract hitmen that killed her father. She doesn't believe her father died of suicide.
Yeah. Why is she allowed? So the big question people have about her is that how could she be? I don't think you have an answer, but how could she be convicted of child trafficking, sex trafficking, but there aren't any of her Johns? Where are the people she trafficked those kids to? Go ahead, Nancy.
They're not going to release it. Remember what I mentioned earlier about that client list they had that the girl that slept with John F. Kennedy, and and the FBI's like, we don't need this. We're just gonna light it on fire and get rid of it. Yeah. So the FBI is not there to investigate and hold the powerful to account. They are there to cover up for their crimes and step on you, basically, the little people.
Okay, so
they're not going to release it,
right?
I guess is my point. And I don't think Ghislaine Maxwell's going to talk either, because she went from this dingy prison that Epstein, quote unquote, killed himself in, but now she's in country club prison in Florida doing yoga and having vegan Thanksgiving dinners and apparently having a grand old time.
Why do you think they didn't kill her, but they killed him?
You mean Epstein?
Yes, they killed Epstein. Yeah, everyone knows they did.
I think Ghislaine Maxwell, after what happened to not just her father, but also Epstein, was willing to keep her mouth shut to stay alive.
And he wasn't?
I think he was more of a liability, because he's not just involved in sex trafficking, right? He's involved in major financial crimes and a lot of other stuff.
Okay.
Ghislaine Maxwell is definitely much more focused on sex trafficking, though it seems like the whole Maxwell family, or her siblings, were very much involved in some crazy stuff with Microsoft and Bill Gates that I talk about in the book.
What's that?
So you may have heard the mainstream media narrative that Jeffrey Epstein and Bill Gates didn't meet each other until 2011, but that is a bunch of hooey, because there's mainstream media articles from 2001 saying that Jeffrey Epstein made all his money from his business connections to three men. And those three men are, in this article, Leslie Wexner, Donald Trump, and the third one is Bill Gates. So how did Jeffrey Epstein make a bunch of money with Bill Gates if he didn't, by 2001, if he didn't meet him until for another decade? Doesn't make a lot of sense, right? And then you start looking at this whole relationship, and it's very clear that there's no way that's true. A really good example is a woman named Melanie Walker, who was apparently supplied by Epstein to service Prince Andrew at Zorro Ranch on a couple of occasions. She was recruited by Epstein in 1992, allegedly as a Victoria's Secret model, but there's no evidence she ever actually modeled for Victoria's Secret. He apparently was funding her education, hires her as his science advisor in the late 90s. And then a couple years after that, in the early 2000s, she becomes the science advisor to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Oh.
So if you're going to apply to be science advisor to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and your CV says, my most recent experience is being the science advisor to Jeffrey Epstein, and you're Bill Gates hiring your top science advisor, you would have to know who Jeffrey Epstein is and what kind of science he's into. Right?
Yes. So Bill Gates in deep with Jeffrey Epstein and lying about it.
Yeah, but I think part of it's not just to protect Bill Gates, it's to protect Microsoft, because you also in the 90s have Jeffrey Epstein flying around on planes to official Microsoft functions in Russia, apparently giving women to the chief technology officer who was very close to Bill Gates named Nathan Myhrvold, a relationship with another top Microsoft executive named Linda Stone, who hired one of Epstein's entourage to be her secretary. All sorts of stuff going on there with Epstein and Microsoft. And it's not just Epstein, as I mentioned earlier, the Maxwells. Ghislaine Maxwell was very much invested in a company that was run by her twin sisters, Christine and Isabel, called the McKinley Group or Magellan. It was one of the first search engines. They made an early deal with Microsoft in 1995. And it was Isabel Maxwell that made that deal specifically with Microsoft. There's this very weird article in The Guardian from 2000 where Isabel Maxwell, and I read for the book, I read maybe 30 interviews Isabel Maxwell has given over the years. And this is the only one where a journalist says she started purring and speaking in a fake Southern accent. And she does that when she talks about Bill Gates. Isn't that weird?
What?
Yeah.
Yeah. That is weird.
Yeah. It's weird. So, she must have known him pretty well. I wish I had the article in front of me so I could quote from it. It's very odd. But the other thing, too, is that at that time, she was subsequently running a different company that was very much tied to the Israeli National Security State and the IDF. And that company was hemorrhaging money and its IPO was going to collapse. But suddenly come the two Microsoft co-founders, Paul Allen and Bill Gates, and they pour a bunch of money into ComTouch and basically rescue it and then give it more money, even though it's never made a profit and doesn't really have a real product. And according to Isabel Maxwell, they put it on the map. So there's a lot of associations between the Maxwell family and Microsoft that should be looked at. And same with Epstein. They haven't been. So now,
what about, so now I tell this story on stage in a joke about Alec Baldwin's name appears on the Jeffrey Epstein flight log, right? And that lady that he shot, have you heard that rumor about what her next job was? So
I've heard the rumor, but I don't know if it was confirmed or not.
Yeah, I haven't heard it confirmed. Okay, so let's not.
Oh, what about Whitney? I've been watching a lot of interviews with you. I was just on a plane watching a bunch of this. You brought up they're called the CIA of Wall Street, the Kroll Inc. or
Kroll
something.
Associates.
Yeah, I mean, because we know Nick Kroll, that's his dad's company.
What?
Yeah, Nick Kroll's dad's
Nick
company.
Kroll's dad's?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What about Nick Kroll's dad's company? What?
The CIA of Wall Street's called?
It's very sus.
His company is called
it's like
the CIA
U.S. and Israeli intelligence veterans coming together to be the CIA of Wall Street.
It's who Weinstein hired to go check on his accusers, erase. It's crazy,
no
dude.
Kidding.
Yep.
What's the name of the company, the CIA of Wall Street?
Kroll Associates. Jules Kroll is the guy that created it. Mm-hmm.
Nick is a boy, Ghislaine Maxwell? Is that what we're saying?
Oh, I didn't know that.
Wow. It's tied to improv. Who would have thought?
Yeah. Do you remember when that judge was shot? She was going to look into that case. She was going to rule over that case of Deutsche. Yeah. So the guy that allegedly did a hit on her home is an ex-Kroll Associates employee. Kroll Associates is also the firm that Robert Maxwell hired right before his death.
Nice.
And a whole bunch of other stuff. They did security at the World Trade Center when 9/11 happened, all sorts of stuff with Kroll Associates. It's quite a ride.
One more thing.
to investigate them.
Ron Brown.
One of the guys that helped set them up was part of that sexual blackmail operation about John F. Kennedy I mentioned earlier, Tom Corbally, who was tied to organized crime in the U.S. and then went over to Britain and did stuff over there. He was also hanging out with Heidi Fleiss, the Hollywood madam. Yeah.
I watched a clip of Whitney talk about Ron Brown because I got like a stupid random memory, right? And I remember Ron Brown, the guy that died like back. I can't remember what was George W. and all this, but you were talking about Ron Brown's mysterious death. I was like, is this the same? You said he looked like Lando, and I was like, oh, that is him. So Kyle Dunnigan, my buddy that I make comedy videos with, his dad was the lawyer who had the big case against the faulty navigational system. And my friend's dad was the lawyer that sued for that supposedly faulty navigational system. And
yeah, the guy that was at the airport in Croatia that was supposedly partly responsible for the navigation error was found 2 days later after that plane crash with a gun wound to the chest, and it was ruled a suicide.
I don't know what you guys are talking about.
No. Sorry, I should go back. Yeah, so let's go back to the Clinton White House Epstein visits for a second, so I can explain where Ron Brown fits into all of this. Right. But before I start, Ron Brown was Clinton's Secretary of Commerce.
Okay.
Right. So we'll start there. So Jeffrey Epstein, I mentioned his first meeting was with Robert Rubin. His second meetings in 1993 were around this fundraiser that makes an appearance in Vince Foster's suicide note, among other things. And then after that, Jeffrey Epstein has 15 meetings in about a year with a guy named Mark Middleton. Mark Middleton died earlier this year with an extension cord around his neck and a shotgun wound to the chest in Little Rock, Arkansas. It was ruled a suicide.
Well, he must have been depressed.
He wanted to make sure he died.
Well, here's the other thing. Mark Middleton was so scandalous for what he was doing at the same time Jeffrey Epstein was meeting with him that he was being investigated by Congress. And the only reason that investigation never finished is because the first time George W. Bush, the subsequent president, invoked executive privilege was to keep documents about Mark Middleton from being made available to Congress. Mark Middleton was not a big fish, you would think, at the White House. He was just an aide to the chief of staff to Bill Clinton. So what was going on with Mark Middleton there? Well, it's mostly remembered as this scandal in 1996 called the campaign finance scandal of 96 related to the fundraising of the DNC for Clinton's reelection campaign. But a lot of what was going on is that foreign citizens were laundering campaign contributions, filling DNC coffers, but a lot of it was targeting Ron Brown. And a lot of what was going on there were efforts to change Commerce Department policy so that a lot of very sensitive military technology could be sent to adversary nations when that was normally not allowed. And some of the people at the center of this were people like Lockheed Martin CEOs, who actually later goes on to create In-Q-Tel for the CIA. And you have a guy named Bernard Schwartz that used to run Laurel Space. He was one of Biden's biggest donors in 2020. And so basically you have this influence, this huge effort to undermine the Commerce Department and buy off Ron Brown. And Ron Brown, at some point, as all of this kept going on, pieces of it began to unravel. And he agreed to cooperate with investigators. Not long after that, he was unexpectedly invited to go on a trade mission to Croatia, and the plane crashes
like Goodfellas
because of supposedly because of an aging navigational system. Yeah, everyone on the plane dies except for a flight attendant that apparently walked away. But then when she arrived at the hospital in a military helicopter, she was at an arrival with a broken neck. And Ron Brown's body was so odd when it was discovered that people in Congress called for it to be investigated because he appeared to have a bullet wound in his skull, not caused by a plane crash. But it wasn't just Ron Brown. You had like 34 or so other people on the plane, and they were all part of the same, the ITA at the Commerce Department, which was the most infiltrated by this broader campaign finance scandal.
China
that
Gate?
was really...
Was that it? Was it called China Gate?
Well, so conservatives call it Chinagate, but I would say that's a misnomer. So it involved a lot of China stuff, but the family that was really behind it were the Riyadi family, and they were based in Indonesia. And the Riyadi family were business partners and longtime associates of a guy named Jackson Stevens, who basically bankrolled and was largely responsible for the Clinton family's rise to power. When Bill Clinton became governor of Arkansas and so on, and he was intimately involved, and a lot of his companies were involved in things like Iran-Contra, the Promise software scandal, a lot of major espionage activity that's also tied to crime, and of course, Clinton-era cronyism in the 80s and beyond. And so the Riyadi family sort of, they were also very tied up with BCCI, the same bank that Epstein was apparently working with.
It's like a big happy family, dude.
Yeah, but BCCI collapsed in 1991, and so there were efforts after that by the same network to find replacements, and I think that's sort of what Chinagate ended up being about.
Well, listen, this is all fascinating, and I wish we had more time to talk to you today. We're going to have to bring you back on because I can tell there's a lot more stuff to talk about. So, but we have to. So we will try to find a time when you can come back on. This is all very fascinating. People in the chat are going crazy, I'm going to guess.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, people are going nuts. So everybody should check out this two volumes of this book, One Nation Under Blackmail. And the first one just kind of sets up how the government, the CIA, Israeli intelligence all create these
The Mafia.
The Mafia come together. That's right, to create
synergy. It's called
synergy. Vertical integration. And the second one focuses more on Jeffrey Epstein and all his who is this guy?
Maxwell.
That's Robert Maxwell.
That's Ghislaine's father. Okay.
But it also focuses a lot on Leslie Wexner, who is not talked about enough. And he's seriously a crazy dude. I mean, he told New York Magazine in 1985 that there's a demon that lives inside him and tells him what to do. I'm not even kidding. Please go look it up and read it for yourself.
Wow.
Well,
it sounds crazy, but it's not.
He's a very respected
it is
person
crazy,
in Columbus.
but it's real, But why would you tell New York Magazine that unless you're totally off your rocker,
right?
But anyway, if any of this stuff sounds crazy to people, I would encourage you to read the books. I have exhaustively footnoted everything. There's a source for everything I say. You can go and check this out for yourself. Please fact check me all you want.
Okay. Whitney Webb, the author of One Nation Under Blackmail. Thank you for coming on. Thanks for writing the book, and we look forward to talking to you again.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Hey, we're doing live stand-up comedy in Los Angeles, December 9th, 16th, 23rd, and 30th. And we're going to be in Tempe, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, Nashville. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for all those tickets. See you there.